Hello and welcome to the Impactful Conversations podcast with me, Dr. Glenn Wallis, and my very, very good friend and co-host, Nejmi Alexander. Nejmi, hi sir, how are you?
Very, very well. Thank you, Glenn. Middle of the year. Looking forward to this episode. We're going to have a bit of a reflection. It's a good opportunity to kind of think about the conversations that we've been having, the experiences that we are hearing, and talk to that a little bit.
Yeah. I think there's a lot that's gone on, and you and I get the very fortunate sort of opportunity to speak with leaders inside, both small and growing organizations to the sort of mega, global organizations within which we work. And there is no doubt in my mind, and I know you and I have chatted about this, that the macroeconomic situation, the geopolitical situation globally has definitely impacted organizations, and not just from a trade and a revenue generating angle, but the experiences of being inside those organizations has definitely been impacted. That's not my conclusion. Those are the words of the leaders, with whom we get a chance to speak, right?
Yeah, I mean that's fair, right? You would absolutely expect that. It feels like there's a lot more volatility, a lot more pace, if you like,
Yeah.
around uh, you know changes in expectations. Trying to do more with less. I'm sure that is resonant of most for most people that might be listening to this conversation, and that has an impact, right? Like there's a net impact of operating. No one's an island, right? We all operate in this sort of global arena, and so it has an impact in terms of leadership.
Yes. Yeah.
And we've got a great opportunity to talk to and bring some of those experiences to life.
Yeah, and I would say that the other thing that I hear a lot about is the uncertainty piece, and just how all of the things you've just talked about produce an environment which is uncertain. And I think one of the things that both individuals and the organisation itself can do better, and I know you've got some real life examples of this, can do better, is to communicate more clearly about some of those contexts or why some decisions have been made, to not make everything absolutely certain, of course, but to make things more certain where you can. And I think that if people took nothing else away from today's session, I think it's looking at what you can influence, even if you can't ultimately control it, and taking some steps to do that. So we could talk about all sorts of things. Even in this introduction, we probably touched on 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 topics that we could chat about, but there are 3 specifically that we want to address or have an exploration around, and that is, first and foremost, the theme of burnout for leaders seems to have raised its head again in the first half of this year, and there's some fairly shocking stats that we'll share that would suggest that's not a good situation for senior leaders, particularly in organizations. The second one is something that we've hinted at a couple of times because of the episodes that we've already shared, and that is leading in an AI world and some of the, definitely upsides of that, but also some of the challenges that come with it. And then finally, there's this, what we might call the leadership credibility gap, the fact that employees, people in your team, people in the wider organization have maybe higher expectations than ever, and demands that they're placing on the organization and you as an individual leader, and the tension that that's creating on both sides. So those are the 3 topic areas that we're going to explore in this session. Where do you want to start?
Let's get into it. Let's start with burnout, I think.
Okay.
So the leadership or the leader burnout crisis. We've got a few facts and figures to hopefully not put you to sleep with, but to leave a bit of context around what we're talking about here. So recent report of 71%, nearly 3/4 of leaders report high stress. So, a majority of leaders are experiencing this. And nearly half, 40%, are considering leaving leadership roles because of this. Gallup also reported a dip in manager engagement over this past year, and in particular, younger managers and female managers are being hit the hardest. I also know that from other reports, we're seeing like younger generations, or the the younger generation that are entering into the workplace, or taking soon to be taking on the mantle of what you'd expect of leadership positions in organizations, are turning away from the idea of taking on people
Right.
leadership
Right.
roles, having seen the impact of what that can look like for their more senior stakeholders today. And I guess what's interesting there is to explore, well, what does that mean? What does it actually look like in organizations, and what might be causing it? What could we be doing about it?
Yeah. Yeah. I think those last two things are really important, which is, why might that be happening, and an exploration of some of those things that we've heard firsthand, or indeed that the data might be telling us. But also, we've always prided ourselves on trying to offer some advice or some ways forward to improve things and ameliorate the situation. So I think what we'll try and do for each of these three topics as well is offer you some suggestions about a step or two that you might be able to take, to make the situation even a little bit better. And if we can do that and be helpful in that way, then I consider our job done in that sense.
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
I mean, in my experience with the sort of recent clients, recent organizations that I've been working with, whenever we are in spaces exploring what the day-to-day experience is like of leadership, this topic does tend to come up.
mm,
Um, and often, in my experience, the sort of root cause of it is several fold. Often it feels like there is a lack of clarity, or like a greater sense of ambiguity that leaders are working within, um, which can naturally, when there's a delta between, what good like looks like, or what the expectations are, and the reality of the day to day, that will naturally create a source of stress.
mm,
Uh, there's also this idea of having to try to do more with less, which AI can help with, but also there's a greater sense of ambiguity. How do we prioritize? How do we move forward in that context? And also a lack of consistency of expectation I've seen. So, there's greater and greater responsibility and requirement of leaders, but sometimes a diminishing sense of authority or autonomy in terms of taking and making decisions for the best of their team, of their organization. So you've got to take more and more risks, being more and more outside of your comfort zone, and that the rewards are very uncertain. That is a recipe for stress.
yeah. Yeah.
It's unsurprising that stress would be increasing in that
Yeah.
context. Does
Yeah.
that mirror what you're seeing, Clem?
Yeah, very much so. Very much so. I think the one of the things that you said, amongst really a lot of important information in for leaders to listen to, because it might be that it's affecting them, but of course it might also be affecting people in their team and further across the organization. And just to sort of prick their ears up at that point and go, actually, are any of these things going on in our organization, and could we do these things better? I think it's a really useful insight that you've just shared there. I want to pick up a couple, if I might, just to dig in into a little bit. A topic you and I have talked about before, but I'm not apologizing for revisiting it, which is organizations are often very good at starting initiatives or starting projects. I think we both know, and I think many, many leaders recognize that their organizations are very often very bad at stopping or pausing things that they should deprioritize in the moment. So, the inevitable effect of that is you just accumulate more and more things to do. It's not one in and one out. You're just adding all the time. And I think that puts incredible stress on everybody inside the organization. And I'm not, I think being a senior leader in an organization is tough. I'm not here to suggest we should all have our feet up on the desk and it's, it's all easy. I think there are moments when it is tough, but if it's tough every minute of every day, maybe it's no surprise that C-suite execs only typically last 5 years in role before they move on somewhere else. So I think it's something about, how does the organization say, we recognize what's going on, we're going to press pause on that, and that, and you can drop that one entirely, and we'll come back to it when the time's right. And if that's true at an organizational level, I would urge individual leaders and managers listening to this to say, go back to your own desk, virtual or real, and and have that conversation with yourself and with your team and say, where can we create some more capacity? Because by doing that, you lower the stress levels inside the group at least a bit.
Yeah, I love that. They look at your to-dos, look at your to-stops.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
As a habit, right?
Yeah.
And industrializing that. I love that. In so more recently in work in order to help build more clarity of expectations and more consistency of expectations too, both in terms of like the what, but also the how when it comes to leading, what's expected of you to prioritize in in how you lead. We do a lot of work around this idea of like building leadership systems, which is so the intent there is to typically working with scale ups, growing organizations, but also it can work with like whole functions of larger organizations too. Is doing the work to build consistency around how leadership happens in an organization. And what I mean by that is actually measuring what good looks like from a behavioral standpoint, not as a stick to beat anybody with, but as a tool for genuinely understanding how your leadership is experienced, and then also building greater awareness and insight for the organization around the impacts of that across the organization. So once you have that as a data point, as a foundation, then you can start to make more strategic decisions around where you prioritize like leadership development, or even creating spaces for working on how do we build greater consistency. So for example, if clarity and a misalignment of clarity around strategic objectives, or the way to achieve those objectives is a source of challenge, friction, stress within an organization, being able to locate that and then do the work to solve for that is incredibly impactful. And also being able to locate where is the difference in how leadership is being experienced within an organization. Do we need to target working on certain behaviors or attributes of how the culture is experienced in order to mitigate for stress, mitigate for poor retention, people leading to basically building a foundation, a baseline of insight in order to be able to address how this challenge is being experienced within an organization. It can be incredibly impactful. I mean, even with the idea of clarity, and a really simple exercise that we've done more recently is working with the C-suite in order to just answer some core strategic questions. Why do we exist? What are we prioritizing? How are we getting there? And then having the same conversation with the level below to compare and contrast. Like how clear are those really core messages translating across the organization? Where's the gap in, or the delta or gap in understanding? How do we bring those together in order to reprioritize, how we move forward over the next 6 months as a leadership community? Being able to solve for whatever and pinpoint the challenge that's contributing towards, burnout, stress, etc., and then solving for that, being proactive to solve for that specific sort of symptom is incredibly powerful and can't be overlooked. If that's
Mm.
if the organization is feeling that stress, it's a responsibility of every leader to look at how they might be contributing towards it, and crucially as a collective, is it systemic, right? Is there something that we could be doing better as a community in order to address this as a challenge? And I've really seen impact with the organizations that we've done that kind of data gathering exercise, very strategic approach to solving for the symptoms that the
Yeah.
team, the organization is experiencing.
Yeah, I think this is such an important point, which is trying to get to the root causes of, of the systemic failings, if you like. And I don't mean that in a super critical way. It's just that's part of your job. Is no organization goes on without its challenges, and it's whether you're, as you say, taking the time and going through some clear process steps to identify what they are, and then identify how to resolve them. And I think that that sort of then helps you not only address the symptoms, but the root cause. I would just add, if I might, just because you and I would, I think you would expect us to say this, which is if the symptoms are individual level burnout of leaders, one thing that we know for sure is that coaching helps improve mental health, well-being generally, because you're working with somebody to help them at an individual level do the things that you've just talked about at a systemic level, which is, just suddenly get clarity, peace of mind that I've got a plan to go forward with. I've unraveled some of the stuff that's just been going around in my head and been waking me up at 4 a.m. And that can be incredibly powerful at an individual level. So you've got this sort of, again, I think probably we'll end up today speaking at two levels, won't we, quite a lot, which is the systemic organizational level and the individual level. But even the individual has a system within which they're working, right? So I would wholeheartedly urge organizations, if you are thinking or recognizing that there is burnout in your leadership, you've got two levels of work to do. That systemic piece that Nejmi's talked about, but you can also support leaders going through maybe a big transformation program or whatever it is, with some one-to-one coaching, because not only will they get the benefits of the coaching or whatever the objective of the coaching is, but a byproduct is improved well-being, which has got to be a good thing. So you kind of get two for the price of one. We could go on. We could go on, but I think we need to move into topic two, right? So we were going to look at AI and humanistic or human-centered leadership inside an AI world. We've had a couple of fantastic guests on the podcast already talking about this subject, but very interesting data around, I think it's as many as 91% of companies looking to invest more in AI, but that the companies that are doing best at the moment and have sort of seem to be producing the better figures, if you like, and the more positive data in the first half of the year are those where the leaders are still very much focusing on the human element, the bit that AI will probably never be able to do particularly well, because humans like to talk to humans. I mean, as much as I have fantastic conversations with Claude and ChatGPT and other platforms, there's still nothing quite like you and I getting on a call 15 minutes early and just having a chat as a human to human. And I think there's losing sight of that in an AI heavy world, if you like, or a world where AI is more and more prominent would be a mistake. I don't know if you'd agree with that and how you're seeing some of that play through.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the space that we're in is a really interesting time in human history, right? Like we've never seen the prospect of such disruption, which can be opportunistic too. You've got such opportunity, where actually the limits of what we can do is just the limits of our creativity, right? Actually, that's the major constraint at the moment. I mean, sometimes AI is not quite up to the task yet, but it is improving, day by day, minute by minute, and I'm sure before long it will far exceed that. So. Yes, almost every company, and if they're not, I'd be surprised if they are, still competing in a few years' time. That sort of remaining 9%. I don't know what they're up to, but What's certainly interesting is the organizations that I have seen doing a particularly good job of, adoption and innovation and experimentation, are the ones where uh, leaders are adopting an approach to just encourage creativity, to encourage experimentation, and sussing it out. Sharing insights across the organization of what's working, which use cases are we exploring, what custom GPTs have we written for which challenges to solve, and there's like industrialized learning and sharing. I think the challenge that I've seen is that with the opportunity of AI and potentially the threat, a lot of leadership find themselves quite stuck, let's say, in their thinking, in the idea that the world is, accelerating beyond their understanding, and also I think the challenge that places even in the word leadership, right? Like, you're expected to lead, but when you feel that you're behind, how do you lead effectively? And I think that the point that you made, Glenn, is absolutely right. The way that you lead effectively is by doubling down on
Mm,
your humanity, in your people skills, in your ability to unearth and understand, the blockers maybe to performance for the individuals around your team, and being the sort of quarterback to sort of suss out where the challenges lie, and solve,
mm,
remove those obstacles,
yeah,
and that requires, again, creativity and, um, I guess, like, compassion to an extent as well,
yeah.
curiosity in the people around you.
It reminds me of the way that you've just described it, and I haven't heard it described in quite the way you so beautifully did, but it reminds me very much of the strengths-based approach, which
Yes.
is, actually your strength is the fact that you're a human being. And actually, if you double down on your strengths, there's an opportunity there for you to really be super effective. The one thing that I think is often misquoted about the strengths based approach is, and you can ignore your weaknesses. I particularly in this context don't think you can ignore your weakness if that weakness is I don't understand AI. I think you've got a duty to get yourself up to at least a certain level of knowledge. And you don't have to be a software engineer, but you need to know how to employ it, how other people might be employing it, what the impacts of that might be. But I really think there's an opportunity there for, look, I'm a human. I have some real strengths as a human leader, and if I double down on that, I'm actually maximizing my advantage, not minimizing it.
Absolutely. I mean, so, you've just reminded me of some work that I did fairly recently, with leaders around how to lead yourself, the self leadership, how to lead your career in an ambiguous environment. And a strengths based approach was at the core of the thinking. A really simple um, tool that anyone can employ today, is just to do a personal SWOT analysis. SWOT, I think, sometimes could be feel a bit tired. It's like a, you know business studies A level sort of tool, but actually employing it for yourself in terms of understanding where your strengths are and where your weaknesses might lie. What are the opportunities and threats that you can see in your career or in your environment? Being strategic about, what's the sort of career lattice that you could see, the different directions of travel that you could see could be possible,
Mm,
and being very intentional about where you see those opportunities and threats for you personally, and then doing that mapping. How can you exploit your strengths in order to realize any of the opportunities? What does that practically mean in terms of, having conversations to get more experience in context A, B, or C in the environment that you're in? But also, how can you exploit your strengths in order to mitigate for the threats that you can see Two, I tend to focus more on the strengths than the weaknesses. So it's a bit counter to what you just described there, Glenn. But not ignoring necessarily. You need to know what they are, but really for honing in again on that. Like actually, where do my strengths play out in this situation? In order to, I mean, this is from a very personal standpoint, but in order to lead yourself and lead your career, being very intentional in the decisions that you make and the opportunities that you go after, in order to, again, play to your strengths to the most. I think often in this sort of the worry when it comes to AI is being personally redundant, right? And actually, being very on the front foot around your own career strategy in this context can only do you good. Yeah, it's really interesting you bring up that idea around strengths, because it's absolutely right.
Yeah.
Play to strengths always.
The other thing I'm just reminded of as we're chatting is I had a call with one of our previous podcast guests last week, Justine Whitaker, who I don't know if you remember. We had a great, I'm sure you do remember, we had a great conversation. And she has continued to explore the AI space, and I think we should have her back on actually at some point later in the year to sort of update us on her experiences and the conversations that she's having and what she's seeing across the horizon in relation to AI. She had we sort of had a really interesting conversation. She started it by saying that we shouldn't really be thinking about it as AI versus human or AI and human, because that's quite siloed thinking. And if you think about it with an overarching theme that ties those two together, could that be intelligence? And then I think we came up with the idea that, back in the day when people talked about human capital, maybe a way to think about this is not AI and human, but actually intelligence capital. And what are you doing to liberate the best intelligences of both parts of that? And how do you do that? And I said to her, well, the challenge for that is that an AI large language model or any AI platform you choose to use is always on, and it's all pretty much always, unless your Wi-Fi breaks down, is pretty much always working at its optimum. Whereas human beings aren't that. We come back to our idea of burnout. So I think it's what are organizations and how's an individual leader thinking about optimizing their access to their own intelligence. And that's not always easy, because when you're under pressure and the pace that you mentioned earlier on is so fast, trying to access your own intelligence or the best of your intelligence, the best of your insight, the best of your hunch is difficult. And I think I would be the first to put my hand up and say, when I'm tired, I can abdicate my thinking to a large language model because I just don't have the headspace. And I'm wondering whether that's actually very helpful always. But I think there's an interesting challenge there, maybe for all of us, but particularly leaders in organizations, maybe start to think about this instead of, two very distant and unconnected parts. The joining theme is intelligence, and how are you leveraging the best intelligence in order to support the organization's performance?
Yeah.
Just a thought.
Well, I think it's a great thought, and it's, for me, what that means is it increases the personal responsibility of you as an individual, as a leader, for keeping yourself as optimal as you can, which requires, self-care and like prioritizing your workload based on energy, and actually being more intentional about how you approach the work that you do, rather than just on from this time to this time, try and get as much done as you can, which is, I think, certainly that's how I've approached my career for most of it, and it's sort of where I think most people do sort of default to. Certainly in the entrepreneurial spaces, this takes much more focus. Like it's clearer that your business is only as successful as you are at managing yourself. But I wonder if that always feels true for leaders within bigger organizations. And actually, it's just it feels like that's only ever going to increase if you want to have the impact that is possible. Then that's a personal responsibility to prioritize.
I think we'll move on to the third one, but I do think we should come back at some point and do an episode on sort of the leader as athlete, or the athlete leader, or something along those lines, because this isn't about putting ping pong tables in, HSBC's headquarters in Canary Wharf. This is quite a different concept, both personally and again at a systemic level. So that would be an interesting topic to come back to. Apparently 72% of HR leaders say that employee expectations are higher than ever. I don't know if I'm seeing quite that. I wouldn't know whether 72% are or not. It's an interesting segue into this idea that there's a bit of a credibility gap between what employees expect and what leaders in the organization are offering. Do you see that delta? Do you recognize it as true? I've got to be honest, it's one of the three where I feel a little bit less familiar with it. But I wonder whether you're working with, sometimes you're working with slightly different organizations than I might, so you might see that in a different way.
I think it's definitely true.
Right.
It's certainly the case that more and more it's less impactful to take a single approach to leadership.
Right.
Employing your default leadership style and operating from gut feel will work for a proportion of the people that you serve, lead, however you kind of see that. But more and more, there's a higher expectation for a more, personalized experience. And that's certainly, I think there's a generational game at play. I'm sure that won't be surprising to anybody who's, leading some more junior folks who might seem, without wanting to go on a limb, might seem more entitled when it comes to how they're thinking about how they're approaching work. But there are factors at play that contributes towards different, work values. They have different. You might see different attitudes across different age groups. None are more right or more wrong. They're just different, and so that requires you to be more adaptable in your leadership. As absolutely, we absolutely seeing that. The way in which we tend to address that is similar to what I was mentioning before when I was talking about leadership systems. With clients, we tend to run what I call a leadership baseline activity, which is to get a 360-degree point of view around how your leadership behaviors are experienced. And what that allows us to do then is understand across these range of behaviors how well how you rate yourself against consistency and quality of impact versus how everybody else sees that, which can be jarring. I get that, but it's also an incredibly powerful.
No, not jarring at all. No, honestly, I've done 50.
No, but everybody, depending on how familiar you are with getting feedback in this way, I think that can be quite difficult, I think, for people to acknowledge or recognize that there's a difference between their intent and the impact that they have. I totally get that. But it's also incredibly powerful because you need to understand you can't go through life with a blinkered view if you want to have the impact and have that credibility across the range of people that you serve. And so we do that activity. Take a guess, sort of broadly, what proportion of leaders do you feel are like consistent in how well they rate themselves against these behaviors versus the reality, self-perception versus reality? Broadly, how well aligned do you think people?
Well, I, as you might expect, over the years, I've done quite a lot of helping leaders review their 360, and actually, I would say that more often than not, leaders understate their performance against the perception of others. In my experience, there are always those that way overestimate their performance and how they're being received by others. So I'm going to guess that more understate their performance than over. And I don't
Yeah.
think that's them playing the game. When I've had conversations with leaders, that unless they're kidding me, they answered as honestly as they could, and they weren't trying for peer humble sort of thing, by lowering their own score.
I'm sure there can be an element of that, but I agree. I
Yeah,
don't think it's necessary. You're absolutely right. And stating or underrating your impact is definitely um, a bigger proportion of
right,
people than overstate. But about 10% of leaders are like quite accurate with
right, okay,
their own self-perception versus reality, leaving everybody else right. And actually, I would argue that even underestimating your impact is can be as problematic as
yeah,
overestimating
yeah,
your impacts. Right,
100%.
actually, it's really important for you to understand where you're having impact and doubling down on that, similar to the strengths based approach, where you're having unintended consequence,
Yeah,
and understanding that and being able to mitigate for that as well. But ideally, where we want to get to is like a consistency, right? People just
yeah,
have a good awareness of the impact that they have, and with that is an incredibly powerful way to then lead again in a more personalized manner, but playing to your strengths, a true awareness of your strengths, and so having closing the gap between your intention and your impact.
yeah. As you were talking, it suddenly struck me that there's a conflict, not a there's a kind of Venn diagram going on here potentially, which is the things we spoke about earlier on, which is, has the organizations at a systemic level got a set of leadership expectations that is recognized across the organization so that it's consistent, or at least
Yeah.
consistent within a fairly broad framework? And then you've got the tension of, well, how do I apply that into an individualized style of leadership so that you haven't got what is perceived to be a set of favorites, or you're against somebody, or you can't lead this person because you've got a particular style. I think there's some art to that balance, but I couldn't agree with you more in that as a leader, if you've only got one default way of leading, in one sense you could argue that's consistent, but it's probably not actually going to work for anybody because it's kind of so middle of the road that it's not individualized, and actually you miss everyone. I think some people think that a generalized approach is kind of broadly okay for everyone, but of course the opposite to that is true, which is it also doesn't work for everybody. So there's something around your point. Have your conversation with everyone in your team, work out how they like to work, how your leadership matches that, and what you need to do differently, whether that's with the 360 as you suggested, which I think is a fantastic tool, really uncovers an awful lot, or just have chats if you can't afford a 360 approach, and have a meaningful conversation with people around how they're doing, how they experience your leadership, how it would be better, and then try and tailor your approach, again within the organization's aspiration for what good leadership should look like. um,
Absolutely. And
yeah,
there's no expectation to just be wildly different to who you are as a leader, right? I think
yeah,
that's more damaging, like to have a expectation of yourself, or, to believe that the organization has an expectation of you to
yeah,
suddenly be a huge, performative visionary in every
yeah,
instinct, in every interaction that you have, when
yeah,
that's not your instinct and it's very different. We're not talking about wholesale changes in who you are and how you lead. It's just tweaks around the edges to make sure that you're
yeah,
again having the impact that you want to have,
yeah, yeah,
in a
yeah.
more personalized,
Yeah,
more.
and I think coupled with that, there's something around, and I think this again might be something that we'll have to come back to just because of I'm just mindful of the time. Is just because employees have higher expectations doesn't make those expectations right. So there's something about how do you have a, let's call it, I don't know, an impactful conversation about the expectations that they have, why they think that's reasonable. And you might then say, yeah, I think that's reasonable too. Or you might have to say, look, I understand where you're coming from, but either we can't afford that approach or that's not how we do things around here. I think you just have to have a grown up conversation about the expectations. Otherwise, you could end up just rolling over at every demand. And I wonder how much of this, the expectations of change thing, is as a result of organizations not pushing back hard enough against some expectations which are ultimately unreasonable,
Yeah,
or,
I
or,
think
or
that's a
or that they can't
um,
meet.
yeah, really fair point. I think like I know we don't have sort of bags of time, but just a sort of closing thought on what you just described. Actually, quite often when having any of these kinds of conversations with any group of leaders within an organization, sort of scaling or otherwise, um, there is an underestimation of the role the individual has in addressing any of the challenges that they see. I think often people will defer to, although that, if something's not clear, the C-suite needs to solve that, and when they are clear, I'll know it. But they're wrestling with the same ambiguity that you are, and actually, it's an individual responsibility of everyone as a leader to, if you see the challenge, if you have a point of view around how to solve it, to try and drive that, to address the problem, to seize authority where it's plausible to do so. And if you're if you're experiencing any of the challenges that we've described, and can recognize that actually maybe there is something that we need to do, in honor of some of the ideas that we've heard in this conversation, do it. Go ahead and try and drive that change forward, because it may be that you're solving for, it's not just you who experiences the challenge, and actually it's the solution is craving somebody to step forward with fresh ideas or fresh gusto to do that. So please take that as a call to action to go and do something with the insights that we're describing, that we're exploring in this conversation.
Love that. Great note to finish on. I think what's been clear is that these three topics that we've selected, and have basically been selected in part because there was data to suggest that in the first 6 months of 2026 they were important, were clearly important. We've had plenty to talk about and could carry on, because we are coming up against these topics when we have conversations. And my sincere hope is that as leaders listening to this episode recognize some of these situations for themselves, and also can take away some of the thoughts and the offerings that we've scattered liberally across the conversation, and hopefully it makes a difference. That's what we're here for. I just a quick anecdote. I don't know whether I'd shared this to you. Somebody reached out to me and said, do you mind? As if they needed my permission. Do you mind if I use one of the podcasts in a coaching conversation that I've got with a leader as a bit of pre-work for them? Because I think what you'd said about X, Y, and Z, would be really useful. And I'm really honoured. I don't know why they felt they needed to ask me, but I was chuffed to bits that the conversations are being used in that way. I think you and I, whilst I speak for myself, I really love having the conversations. I'd like to think that on the far side, people listening to them are taking them away and doing something with them, because there's some practical takeaways, right?
Well, that's the goal, right? And that sounds like a perfect example of
it was really cool
having impact through our conversations. So that's music to my ears.
Cool. Good. Well, look, thank you for that. I really, as I say, genuinely enjoyed that. I thought there was a lot of our shared experience inside organizations to share with the audience as well. And I'm looking forward to the next one.
Me too.
Good.
Thanks, Glenn.
Speak soon. Take care. Bye-bye.